Hey everybody, welcome to Elder Geek's Elder Speak. Today is Friday, February 21st, 2014. My name is Randy Asenchak. I'm the editor of ElderGeek.com. Today I'm going to be revolving the entire show based around one question that was posted on the Facebook page. So, unfortunately, I'm not going to be diving into too many other topics. Sorry that there was no Elder Speak earlier in the week after the Monday episode. Every time I tried to record one, I kept waking up my son. I need to do some kind of soundproofing solution in my office. But in the background today, you're going to be seeing gameplay footage from Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry, which Ubisoft has turned from the Season Pass DLC to Assassin's Creed 4 to they're selling it now as a standalone product. So you can actually just get Freedom Cry without having to purchase Assassin's Creed 4. Anyway, so the question today actually has to do with the Final Fantasy series. And I thought it was a pretty good one, and it's kind of a complex one, and of course it's always open for discussion and debate, etc., etc. So I'm always more than happy to hear what everybody has to say. But Kevin on the Facebook, on the Facebook, I do sound like an old person. On the Facebooks, Kevin writes on our Facebook page, what are your thoughts on the Final Fantasy series and what it has become over the past 5 to 10 years? How did we go from Final Fantasy VI, what I regard as the best video game ever made, to the mess that has been the 13 series? How does a company like Square Enix go from being at the top of the RPG world to suddenly struggling to release a single relevant RPG? Even FF14 was a complete disaster initially, although I heard it's gotten better with the re-release. I ask because I just got done with watching Jesse Cox's attempt at playing Final Fantasy 13-3. For the first time ever, he was so ticked off that he quit a Final Fantasy game. You should check it out, his 3-part series. It will blow your mind how bad 13-3 is from a presentation, writing, and conceptualization point. I'll actually throw a link to Jesse's video series on the 13-3 reception, because I know Jesse is a huge Final Fantasy fan. In fact, if you didn't know this, Jesse was one of the big financial backers behind the Final Fantasy VI remix called Balance and Ruin, done on OC Remix, which is an amazing album. I'll throw up a link for that as well, and it's free. Initially, they did a Kickstarter for it so that the musicians could get funded to actually do the work, and then once it was funded and done, then they made it a free to everybody kind of product, which is great. And again, it's an amazing soundtrack. I totally recommend it. I also, to that statement, I don't think 6 is the greatest game of all time. My thoughts as to what the greatest game of all time changes from week to week, but it is easily my favorite Final Fantasy game. And as far as what happened to Square Enix, the simple answer is Final Fantasy VII happened to Square Enix. Now, before anybody goes all crazy and is like, Final Fantasy VII is the best, Final Fantasy VII is an amazing game. And for anybody who was, I don't want to say alive, but anybody who was, at an age where they would remember exactly what things were like when Final Fantasy VII came out, not only was that a big game, but that was a cultural phenomenon in terms of what video games did. But before I get into saying, it's all Final Fantasy VII's fault, I'd like to really try to draw a parallel between Final Fantasy VII and Jaws. Kind of sounds weird to really have nothing to do with each other. But in Hollywood, Jaws, which came out in, 75? Yeah, Jaws came out in the summer of 75. Before the summer of 75, the term blockbuster or summer blockbuster, or even just the term blockbuster, was used as a term for viewers saying that the movie was so great it was a blockbuster. Blockbuster being a reference to the bombs that were actually used in the 1940s that were large enough to destroy block-sized, city areas. So people were saying, it was a blockbuster. It was amazing. It was so great. Later that was kind of adopted and put specifically by Hollywood onto their movies. So it was kind of taken away from the audience and it was given to Hollywood. Now Hollywood has this thing called blockbusters. And the reason is Jaws in the summer of 1975 was so successful that pretty much every summer thereafter, not only has Spielberg been trying to top himself, but every other movie theater out there has been like, we've got to have a big summer release. We have to have these big summer blockbusters that need to come out, and they need to just absolutely dominate. Now, if you talk to anybody who is a big film, buff or a film history fan, a lot of people will consider Jaws to be one of the greatest movies of all time, but a lot of people will also consider it to be one of the worst movies of all time. Because of Jaws, we now have this summer blockbuster mentality, and summer blockbusters, while they might be fun and enjoyable, might not have been what Hollywood needed to push the medium forward to stay relevant. Sure, some summer blockbusters are really fun, but you also have to admit, I'm sure plenty of you have seen summer blockbusters that have been absolute crap. So ever since 1975, Hollywood has been trying to constantly top themselves. And you can even see in Spielberg's own career, now Spielberg is one of the greatest filmmakers, of all time, but even in his career, he has released some gigantic flops. It's tough to one-up yourself. When you peak like that, how do you continue to stay relevant, kind of thing? Fortunately for Spielberg, he's a talented filmmaker, so he just continues to make films, and people enjoy them. But that's just kind of the way it happens. He reached an entirely new point for Hollywood, and it was literally a genre-defining moment. That same thing happened with Final Fantasy VII, when Final Fantasy VII came out. Up until Final Fantasy VII came out, Final Fantasies 1 through 6 were well received amongst their audiences. Final Fantasies 1 through 6 were not genre-transcending kind of big. People who enjoyed fantasy games, people who enjoyed, Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that, and fantasy books and fantasy movies, that was the audience that Final Fantasy was appealing to. They were made by those kinds of people, and they were appealing to that kind of people. And that was a small portion of people who were playing video games in the first place at the time. Again, you have to think back in, pre-2000 era, when people played video games, they were automatically deemed as geeks and dorks and nerds and stuff like that. Nowadays, video games are socially acceptable amongst everyone. People talk about video games just as much as they'll talk about movies or television or sports. It wasn't so back then. Talking about video games was almost like an instant social faux pas. So here you are in 1997. Let me actually pull up the numbers here. I just had it in front of me. Final Fantasies 1 through 6 sold well. Again, Final Fantasy 6 sold 3.4 million copies, which is amazing for a game. Now that was worldwide. That was Japan, US, everywhere. Final Fantasy 7, which was sold. Come on, where's that number? 7 sold 9.8 million copies internationally. So it almost tripled the sales of Final Fantasy VI. And since then, Final Fantasy VIII hit 8.1 million. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy IX only sold like 3 million, which is a crime against humanity, because 9 is one of the greatest ones, made as well. But 7 set the bar everywhere for fantasy games, for JRPGs. Up until then, other gamers didn't play JRPGs. Suddenly people who didn't even like JRPGs, people who were making fun of the dudes that were playing fantasy games, were picking up Final Fantasy VII because they had heard about it, and because they saw their friends playing it, and they were like, wow, this is really cool, whether they liked the fantasy and didn't want to admit it, or they were won over by like the cutscenes that were in that game, which were kind of ahead of their time as well for the time. So Final Fantasy VII is what did it, really. They pushed them over the top. Suddenly Square had this gigantic success. They'd been making ends meet up until then, but now 7 just put them on the map for everyone, for RPG fans and non-RPG fans alike. So what do you do in that moment? When you reach out to your audience and suddenly you've got something that is just printing you money, and what do? You keep remaking that game. And so, in a sense, when you play 8, there's a lot of influence of 7 within 8. I mean, look at, I think his name was Zell. He looked just like Cloud, except he had like a tattoo on his face. I think his name was Zell. My memory's getting getting a little fuzzy. I haven't played 8 in a while. Even when 10 was coming out, people were comparing Tidus to what Cloud looked like. Every game since then, people have been looking for another Cloud. People have been looking for another Tifa. People have been looking for another Sephiroth. So since then, Square has been trying to create their next Final Fantasy VII, and they've been, and it happens with other JRPGs as well. Suddenly other JRPGs who were doing their own thing suddenly started copying that Final Fantasy VII formula. And that's really what happened. It's sort of the same way as to what has happened and is happening with MMOs. Other MMOs up until World of Warcraft were doing their own thing, and they were finding their own success, and they were being original. Dark Age of Camelot was completely different from Ultima Online, which was, completely different from EverQuest, which was completely different from, a ton of other games that were coming out at the time. And now, since World of Warcraft came out, everybody is trying to tap into that World of Warcraft success. And whether it's unconsciously or consciously, whether it's because they think to themselves, well, our audience isn't going to accept anything different, or maybe they're thinking to themselves, we need to create the same thing because this other thing has seen so much success, we got to do what they did. The other response might be, like, fans of MMOs. A lot of people have just gone in with World of Warcraft being their first and only MMO, and then they think to themselves, this new game is nothing like World of Warcraft. I really don't like it. So it's kind of a damned if you do and damned if you don't situation from the developer standpoint, and it's a damned if you do and damned if you don't situation from the player's standpoint. Same thing with Final Fantasy. And I would like to extend this I don't know, this infection of success, and that's really what it is, over to the Baldur's Gate series and Bioware. Baldur's Gate was amazing, and Obsidian as well, but maybe not so much Obsidian, but Bioware was making some of the greatest RPGs known to gamers. And, again, they were hitting those pocket markets, with Baldur's Gate, and then when they did the Knights of the Old Republic series, that was fantastic. But again, here was RPGs, really not something that a ton of people play. For Star Wars fans, so like an even smaller fan base. So for Star Wars fans and for RPG fans, here's an even smaller and smaller fan base. But of course, those fan bases themselves are pretty large. But what I'm saying is they were marketing themselves to a very specific crowd of people. And then when they broke out of the Star Wars formula, they made Mass Effect. And I would say Mass Effect was their Jaws, and I would say Mass Effect was their Final Fantasy VII. Mass Effect was a game that was an RPG. To RPG fans, it was an RPG. To people who weren't RPG fans, it was hey, this is kind of a science fiction-y kind of game, and look, there's kind of guns and shootery things in here and everything. Maybe it's not that dorky, and they look like the typical Space Marines. Perhaps this is more Halo-esque than I thought before. So more people were finding out about it, and Mass Effect was a wonderful game. It retained all of the RPG elements of their games of their past. They were not tied to the Star Wars universe anymore, so they could create their own universe. Their universe is pretty much the same thing as Star Wars, if you think about it. You have your Jedi-like people, and you've got your standard soldiers. If you just repainted that game with Star Wars paint job, it would have been a 1-to-1 fit. But then with the success of Mass Effect, it pushed them into making Mass Effect 2, which was even less of an RPG and more of an action game. And then to me, I think Mass Effect 2 was like the end of BioWare. I know a lot of people love Mass Effect 2, just not me. And then Mass Effect 3 was a push even further away from that RPG roots. So now the question is, like, what is BioWare going to be doing? Are they ever going to go back to their real RPG roots kind of thing? Are they ever going to be catering back to that audience that they helped farm themselves? Now that audience that helped them get to where they are, just kind of dangling off on the limb. Same thing with Final Fantasy fans. The fans that helped create Final Fantasy into what it is, or the ones that supported it up until Final Fantasy VII, are still there. They're still waiting. They're still waiting for that amazing game. And no, we don't want to see a Final Fantasy VI Part 2 or a Part 7 Part 2 or anything like that. The sequels never really... I don't think we're ever really a part of what anybody really wanted. We liked those games. They were wonderful stories all on their own, and we just want them to create more little wonderful stories all on their own. And I think that it's scaring them. I believe that the massive failure, or at least I'm going to call it a massive failure, of 13 was due to the fact that they looked at the generation, the console generation, and they said to themselves, gosh, development is really expensive and it takes a long time to do it. Let's put all of our eggs in one basket just for this generation. People are going to love Final Fantasy 13 just because it has our name on it. And we've got a badass female protagonist just like Final Fantasy 6. People are going to really dive into that. And so I think that they banked way too much on the success of Final Fantasy 13 to make 13, 2, and 3 to be, successful spin-offs. So I really do think that's kind of what happened. I think they lost their way. I mean, if you look at even last generation, we had Final Fantasies 10, 11, and 12 all come out within that generation. 13 was kind of somewhere in the middle. Or, I mean, 13 was this year, and 14 was this generation as well. But as you said, 14 was kind of a mess when it launched, but that was more of a mess for MMO reasons and less for story reasons. Of course, they've cleaned it up. Final Fantasy 14 is a pretty solid MMO, if you ask me. Not the world's greatest, but far from the worst. It's definitely worth, I would say, picking up. If you're a Final Fantasy fan, it's worth picking up and playing through it to see how much you like the story. I think right now it's $15, $30, which is pretty good, which is really cheap for a Final Fantasy game. So you say you play it for a month, and if you love it, you keep going. If you don't, you stop. No big deal. But yeah, that's what I think happened to Final Fantasy. I think that success happened to them, and there was no way for them to physically top themselves. Of course, they lost a lot of their great talent. A lot of their talent went to other places, but I think that they stopped trying. I think they stopped daring to create new little unique worlds, and I think that they've been kind of just floating. They've been coasting off of 7's success since 1997, which is a sad way to look at it. I mean, there were other games that were great, but they never expanded upon. Final Fantasy Tactics, which is also one of my favorites, they never really did too much great with that. The Chrono Trigger series, I'm going to call it officially a series now, was amazing as well. They could have expanded even further on that. Even though that's not officially Final Fantasy, I mentally catalog it as such. So yeah, there was a lot that Square could have been tapping into and can be tapping into, but they don't. They keep trying to recreate that Final Fantasy VII success. So anyway, it looks like I've been rambling for 20 minutes now. Oh my goodness. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, guys. Am I off the mark? Am I totally off my rocker? Or do you kind of agree? Or do you have any other theories as to what is keeping Final Fantasy from hitting it big again? I do think they still have it in them, but I don't think that they ever have it in them again to get that kind of success that Final Fantasy VII had. I think that they've got it in them to actually create good games, but they've got to stop catering. They've got to stop pandering. They've got to create something fresh and original, and something that their developers and their creators and their the creative people that they've got hired in there, I want them to create something that they would want to see, and not just what they think fans are going to want to see, because I think that's where they're doing themselves a huge disservice. Yep. There you go. Thanks everybody so much. And thanks, by the way, I got a couple of donations after the last video, so thank you very much to the people that made donations. I truly appreciate that. It's completely flattering. I also got a bunch of really nice emails as well. Totally flattering. Thank you so much. Be sure to follow on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch TV, where I do my personal streaming every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. This week I kicked up some Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, which was a slower game than I remembered, which was sad. I had a good time with it, but not as good as I was hoping. Yeah, that ought to do it. coming next week, you should be seeing hopefully this Freedom Cry video review, and also I believe I'm going to be having a preview for Wolfenstein. Yes, so got that going on. Thanks so much, everybody. If you don't hear from me, have a really wonderful weekend. Take care.